So I figure because I'm reading this outline anyway, that I should just tape it so that I can listen to it tomorrow. If I'm missing anything, I'll make another one. You can only see half of me because that's all. Okay, so this is for sale and financing of real estate, and it's from a Saxer class, but not ours, so there could be things that aren't what we know, but whatever. Okay, so the contract of sale is the agreement between a buyer and seller wherein the seller agrees to convey and the buyer agrees to pay. So convey and pay, convey and pay. The contract is consummated when the seller actually delivers the deed to the buyer and the buyer actually pays the price to the seller. This is the closing of escrow. In the interim, after the contract is executed, there is typically an executory period, 30 to 90 days, where the parties engage in normal due diligence, which includes the buyer gets financing. This is the contingency of the contract. The sellers will want to know if the buyer has cash in the bank or financing. There could be contingency in the contract that the buyer of the house is only going to buy if they can sell their own home. Another important thing going on at this time is they're doing a title search to see if it's marketable and clear. They get a preliminary title report, and that is mailed to the buyer. It says who owns the property and what liens are on it. Normally, a buyer ex ante agrees to take certain terms. Normally, these would be considered encumbrances. These could be easements, restrictive covenants, equitable servitudes, all those great things. The buyer should always read the preliminary report, especially in California. Due diligence during this time is a home inspection. If the buyer doesn't like it, he can pull out of the contract and get his earnest money back. However, this isn't always true in many parts of the country. In some states, the damage must be substantial and go to the structure of the building. This is also why the way for the buyer to negotiate the cost of the property. And there's usually an appraisal to learn the value of the property. If the appraisal comes in lower than the purchase price, the buyer should negotiate, and then the seller can knock off some of the purchase price. This is also due diligence on the part of the lender. Earnest money, I believe K means contract. The statute of frauds must be complied with. So, a contract violates the statute of frauds either by being totally oral or by being written but lacking some essential elements. Neither party can sue for damages or for specific performance, but it does not mean that the contract is void. It's not a nothing, it's a something. It has certain validity. However, if there's an oral contract ex ante, which is purely unenforceable, but the deed is delivered and the price is paid, then the parties can just rescind. Once the parties consummate the contract, it is valid. This is a way around the statute of frauds. If the statute of frauds is not complied with, you need to look at the part performance doctrine. And the elements required to be in writing are the names of the party, the identification of the land or legal description. It can be a reference to a government survey by Metz and Bounds, which would say like the beginning of an intersection of 1 and Main to the Oak 40 feet west, south of the riverbank, north of the place at the beginning. Obviously, there's a problem because geographic things do change. By reference, they could also reference a plat. This is where the land at one time described by reference to a government survey, and now it's part of a municipality, and the person wants to create a subdivision. So they go to the city council for them to make a new legal description. For example, Lot 1, Blackacre Division of the City of LA. The identification could also be sufficient if it's just the street address, but you'd never put the street address in a deed. Some places do, and a lot of times they're wrong. Courts have even held up my farm or my commercial building in court to be sufficient. You also have to reference that you're selling in the contract, and you have to have the price. You don't have to have how it's paid, but if the parties orally agree to the price and it doesn't get into the writing, courts are split on whether a party can show the price by extrinsic evidence or whether the contract is defective. So, closing. In most states, the closing is an event. Papers are traded and signed and notarized and blah, blah, blah. In California, there is no closing, but basically this happens in the escrow company, and they shuffle papers around with the bank. At the closing, the seller executes a deed to the buyer. After the seller executes the deed to the buyer signs a promissory note and the mortgage to the lender, who will then pay the seller. Additionally, the buyer will pay the seller a down payment. Use of escrow. An escrow is a third person who is an agent of neither the buyer or the seller who holds the deed to the property and has instructions not to deliver it to the grantee until certain agreed upon conditions are met. During the executory period, everything is in escrow. Buyer and seller sign an agreement. In most states, the title insurance company will take care of the escrow. If the contract has gone into escrow and upon inspection the buyer finds meaningful problems and wants out of the deal, some escrow companies will not give the buyer back his earnest money without the consent of the seller. Escrows are not required in California. If the seller dies before the closing, under escrow law, it's a valid deed if it goes through escrow. Contract remedies for buyer. There's restitution, where the buyer can get his earnest money back and inspection fees and survey costs. There's specific performance. The buyer gets the deed to the property from the seller for the purchase price. This is the most common remedy that a buyer seeks. However, the buyer doesn't seek this when the seller is not able to perform because of a bad title. Specific performance is an equitable remedy, and equitable remedies are only available when the remedy of law is inadequate. Every piece of real estate is unique, so usually the remedies of law are considered inadequate. When the land has gotten into the hands of a bona fide purchaser and therefore is unavailable, specific performance cannot be had. They can sue for damages, and the buyer has to prove what those damages are. If the property is worth more than the purchase price at the time of the breach, then the buyer can get damages. It's the difference between the contract price and the fair market value of the land as of the day of the breach, which is the closing day. So the buyer would want to say that he lost his bargain. Like if the contract price was $300,000 and the fair market value was $375,000, then the damages would be $75,000. Other damages can also be tacked onto this rule: legal fees, moving expenses, things like that. Rent if they had to stay in another location. If the seller has a defective title, or if seller has sold the property to a bona fide purchaser, then this is buyer's remedy. Lost profits. When the damages are reasonably foreseeable, lost profits are recoverable. The parties should also have had those types of damages in mind at the time of the contract. Increased interest expense. Suppose the buyer had obtained interest of 6% and seller breaches. The buyer is forced to go out and buy another piece of property and has to pay market interest rates of 7.5%. If, because of delay, he has to get a loan at a higher rate, that is foreseeable, and he's entitled to get that difference. This becomes even more vague when it was the seller who agreed to finance. You have to reduce the difference to present value. All of these are subject to the reasonable foreseeability test. The English rule: if a seller can't convey because the title is defective, it's a good faith breach. The only thing the buyer can recover is restitution. If it's bad faith, then he can recover damages. American rule: it doesn't matter why the seller is in breach, the buyer should be able to get damages if he wants to. Contract remedies for the seller. Sometimes they can keep the earnest money. This depends on whether or not this is valid. There is a valid liquidated damages provision in the contract, or if it's a penalty. Courts don't like to impose penalties. So if it seems to be more penalty driven, the court will knock it down. Looking ex ante, was it a reasonable approximation of future damages? Some courts will say it is reasonable in this case and this breach. How large a forfeiture of earnest money is reasonable? Some courts in CA have held that 3% is valid. That doesn't mean that something bigger than this is a penalty. Other courts have held that 20% is reasonable, but typically 3 is reasonable in California. Damages. It's the same loss of bargain as above. Sellers don't like to sue for damages because you have to prove that the buyer was a sucker. You're trying to show that the buyer overpaid, but when you do this, it shows that you overcharged. So if a seller was selling for $300,000 and actual value is $250,000, then damages would be $50,000. Seller can cover himself by selling to someone else. However, he wants to prevent sweetheart deals because the court won't hold this up. If seller sells at $210,000, then his damages would be $90,000. Specific performance. The court will tell the buyer that he shall pay the purchase price, like the full $300,000. This way, the seller doesn't have to show that he pulled a fast one on the buyer. All he has to show is breach. If the contract has liquidated damages clauses and it says, in lieu of all other damages, then specific performance would not be enforced in court. However, if it's ambiguous in the contract, then the court might allow specific performance. Warranties of quality. Fraud. Fraud is present when there is affirmative misrepresentation that is material and the buyer could not have, using due diligence during an inspection, found out about the defect. Duty to disclose. A seller must disclose any material defects that could not be detected by the buyer using due diligence. There are 3 theoretical justifications for recovery by a home buyer for defects in a house. Implied warranty. The weakness of an implied warranty is that it's a contract, so there's no tort remedy. This could be a privity problem, disclaimer, statute of limitations. Generally, they're shorter for short. Punitive damages, it's hard to get them in contract theories. You have to prove every element. Negligence in tort. You don't have to prove it. You just have to show there's a defect. You just have to show they acted unreasonably. Strict liability in tort. Arizona we haven't done that one really, so we're not going to be asked. Okay. A person who buys a home from the builder has the benefit of implied warranty of habitability and the workmanlike quality. The warranty is violated if either of these isn't met. We didn't do that either. Okay, marketable title. A marketable title which the vendor, in fact, does have, which is not subject to any encumbrances and is not subject to any doubt. A title is unmarketable if the vendor lacks all or part of the title alleged, the title is subject to an encumbrance, or there is reasonable doubt as to the first 2. The government's role. The government has a very limited role except for in Torrens states, judges in the court system. So if you have a dispute, you can file a lawsuit. So that's the government's role. Ensuring marketability. There are several systems for ensuring marketability. Title search. In the East, typically the lawyer for the buyer will go to the courthouse and search the title. Abstract system. In the Midwest, the lawyer will just sit in his office and review the abstract book, which is a biography of the land. It contains short paragraphs in every transfer that has ever occurred in the piece of land. This is dying out. You can do title report search by title companies, and you can use the Torrens system. Preliminary title report. This tells the buyer that the title insurance company will insure them against title disputes. If there are too many exceptions, then it's the buyer's job to make objections and say that the title is unmarketable. They can sue for damages or get out of the contract. Pre-closing. Courts in every jurisdiction read into the contract the implied promise to deliver a marketable title. But after closing, the title insurance company will issue a permanent title insurance policy to the buyer. Warranty deed. A deed by a seller that says if the title turns out to be bad in the future, you can look to the seller for compensation. Seller may be living in another state and they may not have the money to pay for the judgment. This is only as good as the person giving it. A quitclaim deed. It's basically saying I'm giving you all that I've got. I'm not saying that it's anything, but if it is, then you've got it. Title insurance. They will hire a lawyer for you to sue the seller, or they will write you a check, or they will try and get the title corrected. A title is marketable if is unmarketable. A title is unmarketable if there is a break in the chain. If you examine the title, you will see deeds from A to B to C, and then you will see it continue to D to E to U. But you can't see where C transferred to D. So there's a break in the chain. The more recent the break in the chain, the more likely it is that it's unmarketable. The odds are that if it's a good title, but it's probably still unmarketable. Correcting the problem. Maybe if the two are still alive, you can find them and get the deed recorded. Adverse possession. But this may not always work. If C was in prison during that time, then adverse possession wouldn't work. That's a really weird extra for them to say. Anyway, most courts say that in order to render a title marketable by adverse possession, the buyer has to bring suit and make C a party to the lawsuit in an action for a quiet title. If there's no title, it's not marketable. You can still take it, but it's not marketable. However, you can have no break in the chain and have a marketable title, but the marketability could be bad, like if D forged C's signature, but not from prison, or maybe that's why he was in prison. Anyway, these are encumbrances, a claim by a third party to the land. Example, mortgage. Maybe it's an encumbrance, but you may want it, like if the buyer takes subject to an old mortgage. Covenants and restrictions, restrictive covenants and negative easements and regular easements. Judgment liens. Suppose E didn't pay his visa bill and they have a lien on the property. Leases. This is an ultimate third-party claim to the land. Easements. There are third-party claims to the land, but if you buy a home, most easements don't disturb you, like a power line or a sewer or the water lines. There are encroachments. Others are encroaching on the land that buyer is purchasing. Improvements on the property buyer is purchasing encroach on adjoining land. We didn't really do this, but anyway, encroachments that violate restrictive covenants. The mere existence of restrictive covenants render the title unmarketable, but parties routinely agree to take subject to restrictive covenants that do not prohibit the intended use of the real estate. Just because one agrees to take subject to restrictive covenants doesn't mean that they agree to take subject to a violation in the restrictive covenants or zoning violation. If the property is found to be landlocked, it is also unmarketable. Things that don't affect marketability. Zoning, as I just said. However, if the property is in violation of a zoning law, then that does render the title unmarketable. Building codes don't change its marketability, and delivering a quit claim deed also, it's still marketable. Merger. Doctrine. Once the deed is delivered and accepted, marketability questions merge into the deed and disappear. You can no longer raise questions of marketability to the seller. You can try and rescind the earnest money. Once you've closed, you can't go back and say, I want to go back and undo the deal. This doesn't mean you are remediless. You can maybe get redress from the title insurance policy or sue your lawyer for malpractice. Insurability versus marketability. Generally speaking, an insurable title is not as good as a marketable title. Sometimes a title insurance company will look at the chain of history of the title, and even if there is a break, they'll insure over it because they think that by now it's at least by adverse possession been owned by the seller. So it may be insurable, but it's still not marketable. Most people could care less whether or not it's marketable as long as it's insurable. Every mortgage transaction involves two documents: a promissory note, where the debtor agrees to pay back the lender and it creates the obligation, and mortgage or deed of trust. It makes the promissory note a secure obligation to the debtor. The mortgage is not the debt, it is merely a security device. You can have a note without a mortgage, an unsecured debt, or you can have a mortgage without a debt being secured. Due on sale clause, a clause on the loan that allows lenders to call the money in if the debt transfers without the consent of the lender. The California Supreme Court said the lender couldn't call the money in just because he wanted a higher interest rate. In 1982, Congress passed a law that said that on due of sale clauses were enforceable for any reason. So that was that. Let's see if there's anything else worth reading. No. Cancel. That may be everything for now. Okay, well, that's good for now. I'll make another one later, but that'll be for tomorrow.